Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It is with considerable hesitation that I set pen to paper to record the singular affair of the Linden manuscript, a case which, despite the extraordinary gifts of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, has remained even now a blemish upon his otherwise unassailable record. In the years that I chronicled his triumphs, it became almost an article of faith that no mystery, however complex, could long withstand the incisive brilliance of his analytical mind. Yet this case, with its peculiar blend of ancient superstition and cold, rational crime, left even Holmes at a loss. I have often wondered whether it was the case itself, or some deeper, more metaphysical unease, that caused Holmes to forbid me from publishing this account during his lifetime. Whatever his motive, the passage of time has loosened the seal of secrecy, and I am now compelled, both by duty and conscience, to recount the events exactly as they occurred, lest their full significance be lost to history. The affair began, as so many others did, in the familiar confines of 221B Baker Street, on a night when storm and shadow wrapped London in a veil of uneasy silence. The wind howled through the narrow streets below, driving sheets of rain against our window panes with such force that the very walls of our sitting room seemed to shudder under the assault. Holmes sat motionless in his armchair, a long clay pipe smouldering in his hand, his gaze fixed upon the fire. I had resigned myself to the comforts of the evening paper, though the flickering gaslight made reading a weary exercise for the eyes. The storm outside seemed unusually fierce for the season, and as the windows rattled under the onslaught, Holmes stirred. "An evening for dark deeds, Watson," he remarked with a faint smile. "One might almost expect the city to deliver something suitable to the atmosphere." I was about to reply when a sudden knock, hurried, sharp, almost desperate, rang out from below. Holmes's eyes brightened with unmistakable anticipation. "There it is," he said softly. "Our dark deed arrives precisely on schedule." Before our visitor was shown up, Holmes reached for a thin pamphlet which lay open upon the table. I recognized the dense, cramped print of an academic monograph, its subject matter so esoteric that I could make neither head nor tail of its meaning. "Ancient ciphers," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. "The language of men long dead, whose secrets have perished with them. Curious, is it not, Watson, how the living are so often haunted by the unsolved riddles of the past?" I might have responded had Mrs. Hudson not opened the door at that moment to announce our guest, a gentleman whose haggard face and trembling hands bore witness to the unmistakable signs of terror. "Mr. Victor Linden," Holmes said, rising with polite curiosity. "Please, sir, do come in and tell us what has brought you out on such a night as this." Before Mr. Linden could speak, I laid aside my paper and remarked, "We were just reading of an extraordinary incident near St. Pancras. A man found dead in a locked room, his face contorted in unspeakable terror." Holmes glanced sharply at me. "A locked room?" "Indeed," I said, "with no sign of violence and no apparent cause of death." To my surprise, our visitor gave a low, involuntary moan. His fingers clutched convulsively at his hat, twisting the brim into a misshapen curve. "That man was my brother," he whispered. Holmes's expression sharpened into keen interest. "Then you have chosen your confidants well," he said. "Pray sit down, Mr. Linden, and tell us everything you know. From what I have read, the police are utterly baffled." "They will find no answers," said Mr. Linden, his voice unsteady. "For the cause of my brother's death lies beyond their reach, beyond reason itself." Victor Linden was a man perhaps 40 years of age, though the deep lines carved into his face and the haunted look in his eyes suggested a burden of care that had aged him prematurely. His hands shook as he drew forth a crumpled letter, its edges stained and torn. "My brother, Sir Francis Lyndon, was a collector of antiquities," he began. His particular fascination lay in obscure manuscripts, fragments of forgotten texts, some of which scholars declared undecipherable. It became an obsession for him. He passed the letter to Holmes, who studied it in silence. "It is written in a hand scarcely recognizable as my brother's own," Lyndon continued. "He wrote it just hours before his death." Holmes read aloud. "The manuscript watches me. I have seen its eye open. It knows." Holmes's brow furrowed. "This manuscript, where is it now?" "In a sealed glass cabinet at our family home," said Lyndon. "It was the last item he acquired, and the most infamous. They call it the manuscript of the forbidden cipher. No man who has attempted to read it has retained his reason." I glanced at Holmes, expecting his usual dismissive amusement at such supernatural claims. To my surprise, he merely tapped his fingers together, his expression unreadable. "You fear for your own life," Holmes said quietly. "I do," said Lyndon, "and I fear that some mysteries, some doors, were never meant to be opened." Holmes leaned forward, the firelight glinting in his eyes. "Excellent. Then let us open this particular door together, Mr. Lyndon, and see what waits on the other side." Mr. Victor Lyndon leaned forward, his fingers clasped so tightly that his knuckles blanched under the strain. His voice, though hushed, carried an urgency that seemed to press upon the very air around us. "My brother, Sir Francis, was a collector of strange and ancient things," he began. "It was not simply a hobby. It became his consuming passion. He scoured Europe for relics others deemed either too obscure or too dangerous to handle. It was during one such acquisition, from a private sale in Prague, that he came into possession of a singular manuscript." Here Lyndon paused, glancing nervously toward the window, as though fearful the very mention of the document might summon its curse upon him. "They called it the manuscript of the forbidden cipher, a fragment of unknown origin written in no language any scholar could identify. According to legend, the few who had attempted to decipher it went mad before they could complete the task." Holmes let out a short, dry laugh, but Lyndon did not react. "My brother became obsessed," he continued. "Day and night he pored over it, convinced he could unlock its meaning. But as the days passed, his letters grew strange. He spoke of the manuscript watching him, describing the sensation of an unseen eye tracking his every movement. A chill crept into the room at his words, though the fire still burned brightly in the grate. And then, 2 nights ago, they found him, dead, his face twisted into a mask of unspeakable terror." Holmes, who had thus far remained uncharacteristically silent, let out a soft breath through his nose, his fingers drumming lightly upon the arm of his chair. "Superstitious nonsense," he declared. "A man dies in a locked room, and we are to believe the culprit is some spectral manuscript with malevolent intent. No, Mr. Lyndon, I assure you, the explanation will be found among far more terrestrial causes." Lyndon opened his mouth to protest, but Holmes raised a hand. "Every so-called cursed object I have ever encountered has proven, upon investigation, to be nothing more than the work of flesh and blood hands. Fear clouds the mind, sir, and imagination can conjure horrors where none exist. This, I promise you, will be no exception." Yet even as he spoke, I caught a fleeting expression crossing Holmes's face, a flicker of intrigue, swiftly suppressed. Whatever his words, the puzzle had already ensnared him. With trembling hands, Lyndon withdrew a small, crumpled scrap of paper from his breast pocket and passed it to Holmes. "This was found clenched in my brother's hand," he whispered. Holmes unfolded the paper and held it close to the light. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, as though written in some paroxysm of fear. Only 2 words were scrawled upon the page. It watches. For a moment, Holmes stared at the message in silence. Then, with a sudden snap of his fingers, he sprang from his chair. "Watson, fetch my coat. We have no time to lose." We set out the following morning under a sky that hung low and heavy over London, a pale mist curling like smoke through the streets. Holmes, as was his habit in cases of peculiar interest, was silent for the better part of our journey, his gaze fixed through the cab window as if seeking to divine the secrets of the day ahead from the shifting vapours. "Your thoughts, Holmes?" I ventured at last, eager to break the oppressive silence. "It is a curious case, Watson," he said, without turning his head. "A man dead of terror in a locked room, a brother whose fears have driven him to my door, and at the heart of it all, a manuscript whose very language defies identification." His thin smile flickered. It would be unkind to deny it a measure of interest. As we neared the outskirts of the city, the fog thickened, turning the world into a series of shadowed shapes. The very air seemed to press upon us with damp and spectral weight. "Superstition thrives in weather like this," Holmes remarked. "Let us hope our Mr. Linden's fears have not infected you as well, my dear Watson." The Linden estate stood at the end of a narrow, overgrown lane, a house whose ancient stonework seemed to have surrendered entirely to ivy and creeping moss. As we stepped inside, I could not suppress a shudder. The air bore the stale scent of damp parchment and long-sealed rooms, and a certain stillness hung over the place, as though time itself had paused to listen. Holmes moved forward with that peculiar feline grace of his sharp gaze flitting from object to object, the grim masks leering from the walls, the shelves laden with curious idols, and a display cabinet filled with glass-encased fragments of manuscripts in languages I could not hope to identify. There was something oppressive in the air, a weight not physical, but born of the sheer accumulation of strange relics and forgotten things. "This is no mere collector's home," I murmured. "It feels more like a shrine." Holmes nodded, pausing before a case that held a slender bronze dagger whose blade was stained dark along the edge. "A shrine," he repeated, "or a tomb." He turned sharply as footsteps sounded from the staircase. A woman, pale and grave, descended toward us, her hands clasped before her like a mourner at a graveside. "Miss Evelyn Linden, I presume," Holmes said. She inclined her head. "I fear you have come for answers, Mr. Holmes," she said softly. "But there are none to be found here, only warnings that were never heeded." Miss Evelyn led us into the late Sir Francis's study, a chamber whose gloom was scarcely eased by the feeble daylight filtering through the window. A fire crackled weakly in the grate, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "My uncle believed knowledge was its own reward," she began. "He scoured the world for forbidden things, texts no scholar would touch, artifacts no museum would display." Her voice trembled slightly. "The manuscript was his last prize, and his undoing." Holmes settled into a chair, fingers steepled, watching her with that gaze which seemed to pierce flesh and bone alike. "You believe this document is responsible for his death?" "I do not know what to believe," she said, "but I know this." He read from it aloud. I heard him late at night, speaking words in no language I could recognize. He said it was a cipher, something no man had ever solved. He was obsessed with it. Holmes's expression remained inscrutable. "And you?" She clasped her hands tighter. "I begged him to stop, to burn it, to cast it away. But he only laughed, and now he is dead." "There are no such things as cursed manuscripts, Miss Linden," Holmes said gently, her gaze, dark and hollow, fixed upon him. "Then tell me, Mr. Holmes, what watches from that manuscript, if not a curse?" For a moment, Holmes had no answer. We were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening and the sharp clatter of footsteps in the hall. A man entered without ceremony, his face ruddy with anger, his sharp eyes glinting with unmistakable hostility. "Carstairs," Evelyn said, her voice filled with evident dislike. "You have no business here." I have every business here, the man declared. You and your accursed uncle stole what was rightfully mine. Holmes rose at once. And who, may I ask, is Mr. Carstairs? A rival, Evelyn said coldly. One of my uncle's many competitors, men who would stop at nothing to outbid each other for the rarest finds. Not a rival, Carstairs sneered. A rightful owner. That manuscript was promised to me before your uncle swindled it from under my nose, and now he's paid for his greed. Holmes regarded him keenly. You believe the manuscript responsible? Carstairs gave a harsh laugh. Believe? I know it. I warned him. Told him it was never meant to be read. But Francis Linden never listened to anything but his own ambition. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. And where were you, Mr. Carstairs, on the night of Sir Francis's death? Carstairs drew back, his expression hardening. That's none of your affair. On the contrary, Holmes said softly, I suspect it may be the very heart of it. We were still in the study when the door creaked open once more, and a man of small stature entered, his face drawn into a perpetual expression of nervous unease. His clothes were immaculate, but slightly too large, as though they had been tailored in anticipation of a more confident posture than the one he presented. This is Mr. Pritchard, Evelyn said, her tone as flat as her gaze. My uncle's solicitor. Pritchard made a jerking bow in our direction and immediately wrung his hands. Mr. Holmes, I hardly know where to begin, he stammered. The matter is complicated. Holmes gestured toward a chair. Then it would be wise to begin at the beginning, Mr. Pritchard. The little man sat down, fidgeting constantly with the papers he carried. Sir Francis confided in me, you see. I was one of the few who knew he had acquired the manuscript, and even fewer knew that almost immediately after, the letters began. Letters, Holmes's eyes sharpened. Anonymous, Pritchard whispered, threatening, incoherent at times, but always the same warning. Return the manuscript, or suffer a fate worse than death. Did Sir Francis inform the police? I asked. No, Pritchard said. He laughed at them. The threats of cowards and relic hunters, he called them. But there was fear in his laughter, Doctor. Watson, I swear to it. Holmes said nothing, but his fingers steepled as they always did when his mind sharpened its focus. Holmes rose without a word and crossed the room to the glass cabinet standing against the far wall. Its interior was lined with velvet, but the only object it displayed was a slender volume, its edges brittle with age, and its cover devoid of any title or mark. This is the object in question? Holmes asked. Evelyn nodded. It was my uncle's prize, the crown jewel of his collection. Holmes withdrew a pocket lens and studied the manuscript through the glass, his eyes darting across its surface with bird-like precision. The cover is leather, of Eastern origin, but the binding, curious. Watson, does it not resemble the work we saw in Prague, in the library of Count Barocci? I leaned closer, though I could not match Holmes's discerning eye. It does seem similar, I said cautiously. But the script, I have never seen anything like it. Holmes's smile was thin. Nor have I, my dear Watson. These are not letters in any conventional sense. They curve like serpents, loop like knots, and seem almost to shift if one stares too long. Such a script invites obsession. I can see why Sir Francis became entranced. A strange, unaccountable sense of unease crept over me. Though the room was warm, I felt a chill prickle at my spine. Does it not unsettle you, Holmes? I asked quietly. On the contrary, said Holmes, eyes gleaming. It excites me. Every unsolved cipher is a locked door, and I am particularly fond of unlocking doors. The study, with all its morbid fascination, held one further curiosity. Holmes moved to the desk where Sir Francis had last been seen alive. There, laid with unnatural care, rested a dagger, its blade narrow, its hilt decorated with intricate filigree. This was found beside the body? Holmes inquired. Evelyn nodded. But there was no sign it had been used, no wound, no blood. Holmes lifted the weapon, turning it toward the light. From the blade's surface, A strange iridescence shimmered, a coating, neither liquid nor solid, but something that defied easy classification. He held it to his nose and inhaled sharply. "Remarkable," he murmured. "There is a chemical component to this mystery, Watson. Note the odor, metallic, with a faint trace of something floral beneath." I followed suit, and though my medical training failed to name the precise scent, it carried an unnatural sharpness, as though the very air recoiled from it. "A weapon coated in poison," I suggested. "Perhaps," said Holmes, "though I have never encountered a poison prepared in quite this fashion. The sheen is too fine, the residue too persistent." "Could this be the cause of Sir Francis's death?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Without a mark upon him. Number, this dagger holds a secret, but not the immediate cause of death." Still, he slipped the dagger into his pocket with evident satisfaction. "Even a tool not used leaves its fingerprints upon the story." Holmes turned next to the body itself, which had been laid out upon the couch, stiffened by rigor mortis. One hand remained tightly clenched, the fingers curled inward as if protecting some precious treasure. With deft care, Holmes pried the fingers apart, revealing a burned scrap of paper, its edges blackened and curled. He held it up for our inspection. "Part of the manuscript?" I asked. Holmes examined the fragment beneath his lens. "Number. This is ordinary paper, not the vellum of the manuscript. It has been deliberately scorched, and the message is brief." He passed it to me, and even in the flickering light, the words stood out with eerie clarity. "It watches." Evelyn gasped, and I confess the hair at my nape stirred. Holmes, however, merely tucked the paper into his notebook, his expression as placid as if he had been handed a shopping list. For several minutes, Holmes prowled the room in silence, his gaze flicking from floor to window, from desk to wall, as though assembling a puzzle invisible to the rest of us. He paused by the window and knelt, his fingers tracing the floorboards beneath the sill. "Muddy," he murmured. Yet the rain had ceased by the time Sir Francis retired. "Footprints?" I asked. "Of a kind," said Holmes, "but far too faint for an intruder who forced entry. No, the prints are those of someone who stood here, hesitated, and then turned back." "Sir Francis himself?" I suggested. "Possibly," Holmes replied. "Yet they lead directly to the window, a window which, I may add, was securely locked from within." His fingers paused, then hovered in the air just above the sill. "Curious," he said softly. "Do you detect that scent, Watson?" I leaned closer and caught it, a faint perfume of myrrh and something sharp, almost metallic. "Not a usual combination for a gentleman's study," Holmes observed. Holmes stood and turned the window latch, opening it with a creak. The fog curled inward like a living thing. He examined the latch itself, running his fingers along its edges with a care one might reserve for fragile evidence. "No sign of tampering," he said. "The lock is intact, the dust on the sill undisturbed." "Then how—" Holmes's smile was thin. "That, my dear Watson, is the question." He leaned out briefly, casting his gaze along the exterior wall before drawing back. "The footprints vanish beneath the window, yet no ladder marks, no disturbance in the ivy, and the drop to the ground is considerable." "Impossible," I said. "On the contrary," said Holmes, "it is entirely possible, so long as one understands the precise nature of the forces at work." He closed the window with deliberate care. "We are dealing with an illusion, Watson, one crafted with such cunning that even the victim failed to perceive it before it was too late." Mr. Carstairs stood rigid before Holmes, his thin lips drawn tight over his teeth and his fingers curling restlessly at his sides, as though the force of his anger required some physical outlet. "You have come, no doubt, to dig into Sir Francis's affairs," he said. "Allow me to spare you the trouble, Mr. Holmes. He was a thief." The suddenness of the accusation startled me, but Holmes betrayed no surprise. "And what, pray, did he steal?" Holmes asked, with his usual air of detached civility. "The manuscript," Carstairs declared. "It was never his to own. It belonged to a society, A quiet, secret order whose members have spent years gathering fragments of ancient, unsolvable riddles. Sir Francis knew of us. He knew of the manuscript's importance, and he used deception and bribery to obtain it before it could rightfully be preserved. An unusual society, Holmes observed. Your purpose being to solve these riddles. To understand them, Carstairs corrected, though some would argue that certain puzzles are not meant to be solved. Holmes's brow lifted ever so slightly. And did your society send Sir Francis the threatening letters? Carstairs gave a crooked smile. We did not need to. The manuscript itself is warning enough. Ask Miss Linden. Her uncle's fate speaks louder than any letter ever could. He turned to Evelyn with a glare of open contempt. Your uncle's greed disturbed something that should have been left to sleep. Do you believe that, Mr. Carstairs? Holmes asked softly. Carstairs hesitated just a fraction too long before replying, I believe in consequences. The conversation had scarcely concluded when Pritchard, the solicitor, cleared his throat nervously. His hands trembled as he fumbled for a folded document, which he produced from within his coat. There is something else, Pritchard said, a matter which Sir Francis instructed me to handle, though I confess I found it rather alarming. Holmes accepted the paper and unfolded it. His eyes skimmed its contents, and for the first time that morning, I saw his brows rise in earnest interest. Insurance, he said. Pritchard nodded. The manuscript, Mr. Holmes. Sir Francis took out a policy upon it, insuring its worth at a truly extraordinary sum. How extraordinary? I asked. £10,000. Even Holmes gave a soft whistle. A remarkable valuation for a document no one can read. Sir Francis insisted it was priceless, Pritchard explained. He claimed it held the key to all lost knowledge, the very language of the ancients. He said that if the manuscript were lost, so too would the chance to recover the greatest secrets of history. Or, Holmes said quietly, it was a convenient reason to place a very earthly price upon it. The possibility that Sir Francis's death might have been less supernatural and more financial took firm root in my mind, though the manuscript's grip upon the imagination had already begun to work its darker influence upon me. Miss Linden, who had remained silent throughout Carstairs' outburst and Pritchard's revelations, now rose from her seat, her hands twisting one within the other as though she sought to wring some unbearable secret from her own fingers. There is something you must know, she said at last, her voice so low that we leaned forward to catch her words. My uncle believed the manuscript was cursed, but not in the way you might think. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Explain. It was the reading of it aloud, she said. That was the danger. According to the legends, those who attempted to speak its words into the air suffered madness, or worse. It was said that the language itself could not live in the human mind, that the shapes of its letters were not meant to pass through mortal tongues. Superstitious nonsense, Holmes said briskly, but Evelyn shook her head. I heard him, Mr. Holmes, she whispered. Late at night, when he thought the house asleep, I heard my uncle speaking. The words made no sense. His voice seemed to shift, as though two men spoke from one throat, and after each reading, he became more withdrawn, more afraid. I felt an involuntary shudder pass through me, though Holmes's face remained impassive. And did you, Miss Linden, ever attempt to read the manuscript yourself? She paled visibly. Once, she said. Only once. And what I heard in my own voice, I cannot forget. It is an article of faith among those who know me that I am, by nature, a man of science. My training as a physician and my years alongside Holmes had honed a healthy skepticism toward all things supernatural. And yet, I cannot deny that Evelyn's tale, combined with the oppressive atmosphere of that house and the unaccountable dread I had felt since laying eyes upon the manuscript, had begun to shake my confidence in purely rational explanations. More than once that day, I caught myself glancing toward the cabinet, expecting to see what I cannot say. Yet the sense that we were being watched, that some unseen presence hung over the investigation, was one I could not entirely dismiss. Holmes, for his part, appeared unmoved. He worked with his usual methodical detachment, though I noticed that even he refrained from touching the manuscript directly. Each observation was made through glass or lens, as though some unspoken caution restrained him. It was a curious contrast, my own growing unease, born of instinct and atmosphere, set against Holmes's unyielding adherence to logic. And yet, in the depths of his gaze, I caught something unusual, not fear, but fascination. If Holmes was dismissing the manuscript's legend as mere superstition, he was doing so with less conviction than usual. "I cannot account for your nerves, Watson," he said, seeing my discomfort, "but I suggest we apply our minds to facts. The dead tell no tales, but sometimes the living write them down." We returned to Baker Street in silence. I knew better than to disturb Holmes when his mind was turning over a fresh collection of clues, yet the atmosphere in the cab was unlike anything I'd known before. There was no brisk note-taking, no bursts of sudden observation, only a relentless pacing of his fingers against the handle of his walking stick, his brows drawn together in rare perplexity. Back at our rooms, Holmes lit his pipe and took to the hearthrug, pacing with such intensity that I feared the carpet itself might soon show the imprint of his restless steps. He muttered to himself, occasionally glancing toward the window, as though half expecting to find some shadowed figure staring back. "Holmes," I ventured at last, "do you believe there is truth in this curse?" He paused mid-stride and regarded me with an expression I could not decipher. "Belief, my dear Watson, is irrelevant. What matters is the effect belief has upon men of weaker minds. Therein lies our problem." "But you, surely you do not." "I believe," said Holmes, "that I have encountered my first truly dangerous puzzle, one that solves the man, rather than the other way round." I had scarcely seated myself at the writing desk when Mrs. Hudson entered with a letter, her face pale with unease. "A boy brought this, sir," she said. "Wouldn't give his name. Said it were urgent." Holmes took the envelope, turning it over between his fingers. It was of coarse paper, folded rather than sealed, and bore no address. Only his name, scrawled in a shaking, uneven hand. He unfolded the note and read aloud. "Some doors must remain closed. Even you, Mr. Holmes, cannot solve this." The handwriting itself was peculiar, trembling as if written in a state of mortal fear. The ink, I noticed, had pooled in several places, suggesting either a trembling hand or an unstable surface. Holmes read the message twice, then set it aside with apparent indifference. "And yet," he said, "the sender has solved at least one problem. He has discovered where I live." I protested that the note was surely intended to frighten him away. Holmes shook his head. "A warning implies knowledge. Someone knows more than they care to admit. And now they've made the fatal error of involving me directly." Before I could respond, there came a sharp knock at the door. It was a telegram from Scotland Yard. Mr. Pritchard, the solicitor, had been found dead at his office. Holmes's expression never changed, but I saw him close his eyes for the briefest moment. "Watson," he said softly, "the game we play has taken a sharper turn." We arrived at Pritchard's office within the hour, though the sight that awaited us would linger far longer in my mind. The poor man sat slumped at his desk, his eyes wide and staring, his mouth twisted in an expression of such unutterable horror that I had to look away. In his left hand, stiff with death, he clutched a torn page, and there could be no mistaking it. The uneven texture of the paper, the serpentine scrawl, the faint trace of singed edges. It was a fragment of the manuscript. Lestrade stood near the body, his usual bluster subdued. "Locked door," he muttered. "No sign of forced entry. We found him like this. His clerk said he was alone all night." Holmes took the page delicately, turning it in his fingers without a word. His lips moved silently, tracing the strange script. "Do not read it aloud, Holmes," I urged. He gave me a curious look, half amusement, half irritation. "Fear not, Watson. My talents lie in deduction, not incantation. Holmes bent lower, examining the desk's surface and the man's fingertips. The ink, Watson, do you notice? I followed his gaze and saw the faintest smear of black and crimson, as though the page itself had left a stain upon his skin. Whatever killed Pritchard, Holmes said softly, it began the moment he touched this page. Holmes carried the torn page to the window, holding it up to the failing light. This ink, he murmured, is no ordinary substance. I drew closer. It looks black enough. Because you are not seeing it, Holmes replied. You are looking at it. He produced his lens and gestured for me to do the same. Under magnification, the ink took on a faint iridescence, flickering between deep crimson and sickly green. I have encountered this before, Holmes said. There was a printer in Limehouse, now long defunct, who supplied certain occult societies with inks derived from exotic resins and metallic salts. It was believed such inks possessed properties beyond ordinary comprehension. Surely you cannot mean... I mean only that this particular formula was designed to be seen by the eye but felt by the mind. Whoever produced this manuscript understood how to weaponize words themselves. He folded the page and placed it in his pocket. We must locate the printer. If we follow the ink, Watson, we may find the hand that guides the pen. Holmes' instincts led us directly to Pritchard's study window. It was closed, the latch secured from within, yet Holmes spent a full minute examining its edges, as if the wood might whisper some untold secret. See here, Watson, he said at last. Observe the distortion along the glass. I pressed closer and saw it. A subtle curvature, almost imperceptible, as though the glass had been warped by heat or pressure. Holmes gestured for me to step back, then crouched low, placing his face at an odd angle to the pane. There, he said softly, an optical illusion. From the outside, a man could observe this room with perfect clarity. From within, nothing. A one-way window? I asked. Precisely. Holmes stood, brushing his hands together. Someone watched Pritchard, waited until he touched the page, knowing exactly what effect it would have. But how could they be certain? Holmes's smile was cold, because they had already tested the ink before. I felt a shudder run through me. Then the manuscript is not merely ancient, it has been tampered with. Tampered, adapted, refined, Holmes said. What began as ancient curiosity has become a modern weapon, one that kills with ink and fear. It was with no small degree of astonishment that I heard Holmes declare his intention to hold a séance at the Linden estate that very night. To my knowledge, my friend had never placed the slightest credence in spiritualism, nor in any of the parlour tricks by which charlatans profess to summon the dead. Yet there was a gleam in his eye, cold, calculating, that assured me his purpose lay elsewhere. I have no belief in ghosts, Watson, he said as we prepared to depart, but I do have the utmost belief in fear and how easily it may be exploited. Evelyn Linden, though pale and hesitant, agreed to the plan, her nerves frayed to the point where any hope of uncovering the truth seemed preferable to the oppressive silence that had fallen over the house since her uncle's death. Mr. Carstairs and Pritchard's assistant, his sole surviving clerk, were also summoned to attend, both arriving with visible suspicion and distaste for the proceedings. We gather, Holmes announced, not to commune with the dead, but to listen to the living, for it is among us that the answers lie. The séance began at the stroke of midnight. The house hushed, as though awaiting a verdict from some unseen tribunal. Holmes himself took the seat nearest the cabinet that housed the manuscript, his long fingers resting lightly upon the table's surface. "Let the shadows speak," he said softly, and in that moment, even I, who knew better than most the rational mind beneath his theatrics, felt the hair stir upon the back of my neck. Holmes, for all his skepticism, conducted the séance with the precision of a stage manager. Every candle had been placed with intention, every seat chosen with care. Though none of us knew it at the time, each suspect occupied a position that allowed Holmes to observe them without appearing to do so. The manuscript itself remained locked within the glass cabinet, yet Holmes's positioning ensured that every eye was drawn toward it. Evelyn trembled each time her gaze strayed to its dark cover. Carstairs' fingers tapped ceaselessly upon the table, and Pritchard's clerk avoided looking at it altogether, as though fearing the very shape of the letters might take root in his mind. Holmes asked no questions. Instead, he allowed silence to do its work, that heavy, unnatural silence that demands to be filled. And so, one by one, the participants began to speak, not to the dead, but to each other. Old resentments, suspicions, and fears spilled forth in that flickering gloom, until the séance became less a spiritual summons than a confessional. Holmes, ever silent, merely listened, his eyes half closed, his fingers still upon the table, but his mind gathering the threads that would soon form the noose for the guilty. When at last Holmes spoke, it was not to summon a spirit, but to reconstruct a crime. "There are no ghosts here," he said, "only the echoes of greed and the cleverest forgery I have ever encountered." He rose and moved to the cabinet, withdrawing the manuscript with deliberate care. "This," he said, "is a fabrication." The symbols upon its pages, while ancient in appearance, are modern inventions, a cipher masquerading as myth. The legend of the manuscript was seeded deliberately, to increase its value and frighten away any who might question its authenticity. Evelyn gave a soft cry, while Carstairs leapt to his feet. "That's impossible," he spat. "The manuscript has been known to collectors for decades." "And who, Mr. Carstairs," Holmes asked, "first introduced that legend? Who ensured that every whispered rumour carried with it the promise of madness for any who dared to read the text aloud?" Carstairs' mouth opened, but no words came. "The manuscript is a key, not to ancient knowledge, but to a hidden cache of smuggled artifacts, a treasure buried beneath the very foundations of this house." Holmes held up the dagger. The so-called curse was nothing more than a chemical trick, designed to incapacitate those who came too close. "And the deaths?" I asked. Holmes's expression darkened. "The work of a mind far more dangerous than any ancient spirit." Carstairs stood with his hands pressed flat upon the table, his face drained of colour, his usual bluster reduced to a stammering whisper. "Yes," he said at last, the word forced through clenched teeth. "I admit it. I created the curse." Evelyn gasped, and I felt my own astonishment rising. Carstairs straightened, his hands now trembling slightly. "Collectors," he went on bitterly, "are little better than wolves. If you want to keep them from circling, you give them something to fear. A curse, a whisper in the right ear. Soon enough, they steer clear." "You built a legend," Holmes said softly, "and the legend became its own truth." "It was harmless," Carstairs insisted. "A story to keep fools at bay. I never laid a hand on Sir Francis. And Pritchard, I swear, I never went near him." Holmes regarded him with that unsettling, hawk-like gaze I had seen unravel so many liars. "And yet," he said, "the curse you invented took on a life of its own. Fear breeds its own reality, Mr. Carstairs. A man convinced of his own doom rarely requires a murderer's hand." "But I didn't kill them!" Carstairs cried. Holmes tapped the manuscript. "Perhaps not by design, but by consequence, you played your part." Carstairs sank back into his chair, defeated. "I only wanted to scare off the competition," he muttered. "I never meant for anyone to die." Holmes gave a small, mirthless smile. "Intent matters little, Mr. Carstairs. You unleashed the story, and the story did the rest." It was Evelyn who broke the silence that followed. Her voice, hushed and strained, carried across the room with the weight of confession. "It was my fault," she whispered. "Not Carstairs, not the curse, me." Holmes turned, his expression softening by the smallest degree. "Explain, Miss Linden." She faltered, then steadied herself. I thought it was nothing. A game. My uncle was out late one evening, and I, out of childish curiosity, I opened the cabinet and took out the manuscript. Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. I had heard the stories. I knew the curse was meant to strike anyone who read it aloud, and so I did. I stared at her in disbelief. You read the text? Only a line or two, she said, her hands twisting together in her lap. I thought it was nonsense, strange sounds, meaningless syllables, but the moment the words left my lips I felt. She shook her head, as though something had awoken. Her voice dropped further. That same night, my uncle began to speak of being watched. He grew restless, fearful. I had opened the door, Doctor. Watson, I know I did. Holmes was silent for a moment, then said, almost gently, Miss Linden, fear requires a spark, but the fire itself was already laid. Your uncle's obsession was the true culprit. You merely struck the match. Tears welled in her eyes. And Pritchard? Holmes sighed. That, my dear lady, was no accident. Holmes drew the foreign dagger from his pocket and held it aloft, the candlelight catching on its iridescent sheen. This, he said, is the murder weapon, though not in any conventional sense. I leaned forward, expecting some revelation of hidden blades or poisoned edges, but Holmes shook his head. There is no need for bloodshed when a man's own mind can be turned against him. He drew a clean cloth from his pocket, rubbing the blade with methodical precision. The cloth came away streaked with a faint, oily residue, tinged with green and gold. A toxin, he explained, derived from a particularly rare resin used by certain secret societies in the Far East. It produces hallucinatory visions, tailored to the victim's deepest fears. The merest contact with the skin is sufficient. Evelyn recoiled. You mean, they didn't see ghosts, but they believed they did? Precisely, Holmes said. The curse was no more than a chemical illusion, exploiting the very stories Carstairs had planted. And the handwriting in Pritchard's final note? I asked. Holmes held up the fragment. Written under the toxin's influence, a man possessed by his own imagination. But who applied the poison? Evelyn asked. That too is clear, Holmes said. The same hand that wrote the anonymous warnings and stood watching through the study window as each man fell. I shuddered, for the implication was chilling. The murderer had needed only to convince the victims they were doomed, and their own terror had done the rest. With the crime itself laid bare, there remained only the manuscript, that strange and sinister volume which had set all these events into motion. Holmes spread it open upon the table, his fingers tracing its serpentine script with uncharacteristic hesitance. This, he said softly, is a greater mystery than the crime itself. I leaned closer, expecting some final explanation, some rational deconstruction of its symbols and their meaning, but Holmes shook his head. I have applied every system of analysis I know, he said. I have tested its structure against every cipher from Caesar to Playfair, and found no pattern I can break. You mean, you cannot read it? I asked in astonishment. I mean, Holmes said quietly, that it was never meant to be read. This is no ordinary code, Watson. It is a message in a language the human mind is not equipped to understand. He closed the book. For once, we have reached the edge of reason, and beyond that, I cannot go. It was a rare and unsettling thing to see Holmes admit defeat, not in the solving of a crime, but in the face of something larger than deduction could grasp. I watched him that night as he sat alone by the fire, the manuscript lying closed beside him. The sharp confidence that defined him had softened, leaving in its place something almost resembling humility. There are limits to even my methods, Watson, he said at last. There are puzzles not designed to be solved, but only to be feared. I wanted to protest, to reassure him that no mystery could stand before his formidable intellect, but the words died upon my lips, for I, too, had felt the manuscript watching, its silence more terrible than any scream. And so I said nothing, leaving my friend alone with the one puzzle Sherlock Holmes could not solve. The case, now concluded, was recounted by Holmes in that familiar setting I had come to know so well, the quiet sitting room at 221B Baker Street, where so many riddles had been unravelled before the glow of our modest fire. Holmes, seated cross-legged upon the hearthrug, his long fingers steepled before him, addressed me in the tone of detached clarity he reserved for post-mortems of the mind. "The true essence of the case," said Holmes, "lay not in the manuscript itself, but in the legend surrounding it. A legend cultivated with deliberate care, first by Mr. Carstairs, then magnified by Sir Francis Lyndon's own obsessive belief in its potency. What began as a calculated deception became, in time, a self-fulfilling prophecy." He gestured toward his notes, spread like an autopsy before him. The anonymous warnings, the staged reputation, the whispered tales of madness, all designed to lend weight to a forgery. Carstairs understood that the greatest weapon is not the blade, Watson. It is the mind prepared to receive it. "And yet," I protested, "men are dead." "Precisely because they believe the story," Holmes replied. "Lyndon's fear made him vulnerable, Pritchard's imagination made him weak, and each step of the way, the myth drove the man until death became inevitable." "But who administered the poison?" I asked. "Ah!" Holmes's smile was thin. "The hand matters less than the mind that placed the dagger in their path. We need not look for supernatural forces when fear itself does the killing." And yet, even as he spoke, I saw something rare in Holmes's expression, a flicker of uncertainty, as though the case had left its own shadow upon him. "Consider the chain of events," Holmes continued, his voice steady, though his gaze drifted to the rain-streaked window. "It begins, as such matters so often do, with greed. Carstairs desired the manuscript, not for its content, but for its reputation. A man willing to fabricate a curse is a man prepared to profit from it. He sowed whispers, hints of madness, and built a fortress of fear around a worthless document. Sir Francis Lyndon, a collector prone to obsession, took the bait. His own hunger for rarity made him the ideal mark. His desire to possess was matched only by his fear of losing that which he barely understood." "And the solicitor, Pritchard?" I asked. Holmes gave a shrug. "A man caught between duty and dread. He knew of the threats, suspected the forgery, but feared his employer's wrath too greatly to intervene. When Lyndon died, Pritchard's guilt and imagination took over. His own mind did the villain's work, Watson. All that was required was the right push." "And Evelyn?" I asked, reluctant to believe her wholly innocent. "She struck the match," Holmes said simply. "But the pyre was already built. Fear and greed had laid the foundation. The human mind, faced with uncertainty, became its own executioner." He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "We have often seen men killed by the hand of another, Watson. But here, we saw something far more terrible. Men destroyed by their own belief." Holmes reached for the dagger, which lay upon the table between us, its gleaming surface still tainted with the faint residue that had claimed 2 lives. "This," said Holmes, "was both a prop and a weapon. It was a key to the illusion, no less than the manuscript itself." He held it up to the light, turning it slowly. "The oil upon its blade," he explained, "is a compound rarely seen outside certain secretive circles, a tincture derived from resins found in remote corners of the East. It has no immediate toxic effect, but it induces a state of heightened imagination in which the mind's deepest fears manifest as reality." "Hallucination," I said. "Of a most targeted and deliberate nature," Holmes confirmed. "The victim sees precisely what they expect to see. Their own dread turned against them. A man convinced the manuscript is cursed will see the curse take shape, just as a man who believes himself haunted will see the ghost. And it requires only the barest contact with the skin?" "A mere touch," Holmes said. "Pritchard's death was not the result of some elaborate scheme. He held the page, Watson, the page stained with this oil, and his mind supplied the rest. The fear that had been fed into him for weeks took root the moment the toxin opened the door. I shivered despite the warmth of the room. It is murder by suggestion. It is murder by story, Watson, Holmes corrected. A tale so potent, so perfectly calibrated to its victims that the killer need never raise a hand. Holmes turned the manuscript over in his hands one final time, his fingers tracing the brittle edges with the detached curiosity of a surgeon examining a corpse. The manuscript itself, he said, was a fiction twice over, once as a document of supposed ancient origin, and again as a cipher hiding a most earthly secret. Its very obscurity became its greatest asset. Every collector, every dealer, every thief who touched it saw only its myth, never its purpose. He laid it flat upon the table and spread it open to the middle page. This particular section, he continued, contains the cipher key, a pattern concealed within the apparent gibberish, coordinates to a hidden cache of smuggled artifacts. Smuggled? I asked. Indeed, said Holmes. Sir Francis had uncovered a profitable side trade, acquiring not only legitimate relics, but also contraband treasures destined for the black market. And the curse? I asked. A convenient mask, Holmes said. A smuggler's tale meant to ward off prying eyes. Yet even within this fiction, Watson, there lies one true enigma. He tapped the final page. This section, the margins, contains symbols unlike any script known to archaeology, modern or ancient. They fit no pattern, respond to no cipher. He leaned back, his gaze turning inward. I solved the crime, Watson, but not the manuscript. Over the following days, I observed Holmes as I had seldom seen him, restless, his usual sharp wit dulled beneath the weight of unanswered questions. The case was closed in every practical sense, the deaths explained, the culprit unmasked. But the manuscript's final mystery hung over him like a storm cloud that would not break. For hours, he pored over the margins, trying every system, every substitution he had mastered over his long career. I watched him trace the symbols into his notebooks, rearrange them, test them against languages both known and obscure. Yet the result was always the same: silence. It is unlike anything I have encountered, he admitted at last, his voice low with something uncomfortably close to humility. It belongs to no known family of alphabets, neither pictographic nor phonetic. It behaves like a language, yet it refuses to speak. But surely, I protested, there is some method, some key you have not yet found. Holmes shook his head. There is no key, Watson, because this was never meant to be read by human eyes. For the first time in our long acquaintance, I saw my friend defeated not by logic, but by the limits of human comprehension itself. The sight of Holmes thus humbled unsettled me more than any supernatural tale ever could. I had stood beside him through the darkest corners of London, through crimes so vile they defied imagination, yet always there had been a solution, a thread of logic that, once pulled, unravelled even the most cunning deceit. But this was different. Holmes was not beaten by a man nor by a crime, but by the unknown, something older, colder, and beyond the grasp of human reason. It was this that troubled me most of all. If Holmes could not explain it, what hope had I? What hope had anyone? The notion that some puzzles exist without solutions, that there are doors which once opened reveal only darkness, left a chill within me that no fire could chase away. Even Holmes's customary sarcasm, his withering dismissal of superstition, was absent. He did not mock the manuscript, nor did he rail against his own failure. He simply set it aside, as though conceding that some battles are not meant to be fought. I had come to rely upon Holmes's intellect as upon a lantern cutting through the fog, but now, for the first time, I sensed the fog might be thicker than the light could pierce. In the quiet that followed, Holmes rose and stood at the window, gazing out over Baker Street, with that faraway expression that told me his mind had already slipped beyond our world into the realm of possibility and consequence. Some puzzles, Watson, he said at last, are never meant to be solved. They are left behind like bones in the earth. Artifacts not for knowledge, but for warning. He turned back to me. To solve such a puzzle would be to unravel the mind itself. There are languages, I suspect, that are not meant to communicate, but to infect. Some stories are not read. They are caught, like fever. And the manuscript? I asked. He smiled faintly. It will pass into legend, half truth, half invention, until no one remembers where fact ended and myth began. And perhaps that is best. He extinguished the lamp beside him, leaving only the fire to light the room. A solved puzzle is a corpse, he said softly. But an unsolved one, that becomes a legend. Years have passed since the affair of the Linden manuscript, yet it remains the only case I have refrained from publishing until now. It was not fear of scandal nor legal propriety that stayed my hand, but something deeper, a lingering unease that I could never entirely explain. I have seen Sherlock Holmes defeat the cleverest minds of our age. I have seen him expose villains so cunning they seemed almost supernatural. Yet never before, or since, have I seen him face a puzzle that looked back at him. The manuscript lies now in some government archive, gathering dust like all things men fear to touch. But I know, Holmes knows, that its story is not over. There are mysteries that yield to logic, and there are those that watch from the shadows, waiting for someone foolish enough to read them aloud. And so ends the one case Sherlock Holmes could not solve. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the sitting room at Baker Street, when Holmes spoke again. His voice quieter than usual, as though addressing the thought more than the man beside him. There are moments, Watson, he said, when the mind meets a puzzle not meant for understanding, but for endurance. This was not a case of crime alone. It was a case of belief, a belief so powerful that it made its own truth. I glanced toward the manuscript, now closed and resting upon the mantelpiece. Yet even belief, I said, could not have acted without the hand of a living man. True, Holmes replied, but fear, once set loose, becomes its own accomplice. The true villain in this affair was not Carstairs, nor Evelyn, nor even the nameless figure who coated the dagger's blade. Then who? I asked. The story itself, Watson. Holmes lit his pipe, watching the tendrils of smoke rise toward the ceiling. A story, well told and believed, is the most dangerous weapon of all. And what of the manuscript? I asked. What do you truly believe it was? Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke. Perhaps a forgery. Perhaps something older than language itself. He paused. But some doors are best left closed, and this, I think, was one of them. And now, dear reader, I turn to you. In every case Sherlock Holmes has solved, there has always been a single pivotal mistake made by the guilty. In this case, was it Carstairs' invention of the curse, Evelyn's whispered words, or the unseen hand that coated the dagger? What do you believe was the criminal's greatest mistake? Share your deduction in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of deduction, deception, and the dangers of belief, be sure to subscribe for more untold Sherlock Holmes mysteries, and share this story with fellow lovers of classic detective fiction. After all, some mysteries are meant to be solved together. The game, dear friends, is still afoot.